I'd like to just introduce our speaker this evening. It's Chris Kolakowski. Chris is the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum located in Madison, Wisconsin. He's an experienced historian with a background in museums, battlefield tours, and preservation. He is a published writer on various aspects of military history from 1775 to the present. His specialties are public speaking, writing, and research. His published books include The Civil War at Perryville, Battling the Bluegrass and Stones River and Tullahoma campaigns, The Army Does Not Retreat, and the Virginia Campaign, March through August 1862. It's got quite a history there, and I'm not going to throttle up time and say, you're wrong, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's great to see everybody tonight. Looking forward to a great discussion. I'm going to talk for probably 40 to 45 minutes. I want to leave time for questions, and I'm going to be mindful of the clock because I know the meeting room's got a hard stop at 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock on my time. But it's great to see all of you, meet all of you. I actually went to grad school in Albany, New York, so not terribly far from you all. And actually, I have ancestors that were in the Committee of Correspondence in Dudley during the American Revolution, almost 250 years ago. So there's a little bit of Bay State bona fides for me, if you will. But it's great to see everybody tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk and I'm going to provide some perspectives. I'm not necessarily going to give you a blow-by-blow of the Virginia 1862 campaigns. There are many fine books. I know many of you have probably visited the battlefields, are very familiar with the campaigns. But what I want to do instead is I want to highlight some things that either may have slipped off the radar or may have gone unnoticed, and just kind of get you some things to think about, some things kind of looking at these campaigns in a new light. And so with that, I'm just going to dive right in. And the first thing we're going to do before we do anything else is start with a map, because it's always good to do good military history with a map. I'm assuming this can be seen, otherwise they'd be waving at me in the room.
Looks good. Thank
Great.
you.
So this is Eastern Virginia. I know, by show of hands, how many of you have been to any of these battlefields that we're going to be talking about here? The Shenandoah Valley, the Richmond battlefields, Manassas. Okay, that gives me a good idea of what of who's been where. So this is Eastern Virginia. Here we are. North is at the top. Where I've put my cursor is Washington, D.C. From Washington, D.C., 30 miles to the west is Manassas. From D.C., 50 miles to the south is my hometown of Fredericksburg. 50 miles south of Fredericksburg is Richmond. 70 miles east is Yorktown and Fort Monroe right here. And then just across the water is Norfolk, Portsmouth, that area. Here's Chesapeake Bay, as you can see, running the eastern side of Virginia. And of course, Maryland up here, Antietam, which is outside of our scope, and then Pennsylvania, as you can see here, Gettysburg, Harrisburg at the very top of the map, Philadelphia. The Shenandoah Valley, I'm running down with my cursor right here, which stretches about 60 miles or so from Winchester all the way down to Stanton and all points in between, with the Blue Ridge Mountains separating it from this part, which is known as the Virginia Piedmont. And I'll orient you more to the map as we go, but at least that gives you some idea of kind of the area that we're talking about here, and the area where these campaigns took place. And I'm talking specifically about the period March 1st, 1862 to September 3rd of 1862. So we're looking at the Jackson's Valley campaign. We're looking at the Peninsula campaign, the 7 days battles. We're looking at Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, depending on your proclivities, and Chantilly. So that's the period of the war that we're looking at. It's a really interesting period of the war, particularly when you think about what's going on elsewhere at the same time. Now, when you look at this map, here's the first thing I want to bring out about these campaigns is we should not forget that from March 17th until basically July 22nd, 1862, there was no commanding general of the U.S. Army. The commander-in-chief was President Lincoln. It's one of the very few times that the United States president has directly been commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. Okay, so that's the first thing that should be mentioned. Before that, it had been George McClellan, who, with his Army of the Potomac, massed up here in and around Washington and along the upper Potomac, was preparing to move on Richmond. And this is the beginning of what's known as the famous On to Richmond, one of the first of the On to Richmond campaigns. And his plan is to leverage the use of the Navy's control of the Chesapeake Bay, move his army by water to Fort Monroe. It becomes clear, though, that as he's planning this campaign to advance from Fort Monroe to Richmond, he can't pay as much attention to what's going on elsewhere, particularly when you think about what's going on in the West. Tennessee campaign, Missouri River or Mississippi River campaign starting to get going. And so Lincoln relieves him and replaces him with himself. The reason that I mention that is because that is going to influence how the Federals look at this theater. When you look at this theater, you'll notice that really there's two areas of fighting in the spring and summer of 1862. It's centered on the Shenandoah Valley with the Jackson campaign, and then it's centered in and around Richmond before ultimately combining here in Northern Virginia. But for our purposes, the Peninsula campaign and the Valley campaign, are they linked in any way? From the Federal view, no. But in the Confederate view, absolutely. Because, for this reason, Winchester is 70 miles from Washington. And if you notice, Winchester is slightly north of Washington, D.C. And so Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and his military advisor, Robert E. Lee, realize if they can create havoc here in the Valley, they can pressure Washington. And they already know, they already sense, that Lincoln and his Secretary of War, William Stanton, are, I blanked on his first name, Stanton. I'm blanking on his first name, but you all know who I'm talking about. They are inordinately sensitive to even the remotest threat to Washington. And one of the reasons that McClellan's under a lot of pressure to leave troops behind in the defenses of Washington, to not take the full army. But he's been pretty secretive about that. He's going to try and move his entire 100,000-man army in stages starting around mid-March and assemble it here at Fort Monroe by early April. Confederates pick up on this. They've got a defense line across the peninsula right here at Yorktown. Lee realizes the import of all this, and he realizes that one part of McClellan's army, Nathaniel P. Banks's Fifth Corps, as it's officially known, sitting up here at Winchester, through intelligence, they realize that Banks has orders, sailing orders, to march to Alexandria and then board boats and basically be the last element of McClellan's army to leave. There's also Irvin McDowell's big First Corps that is hanging out up here as well, that are the last really to get on the ships. And so in mid-March, Lee sends a message, an imperative message to Jackson. It is imperative that you keep, and this is very close to a quotation, it is imperative that you keep that army, in other words, Banks's force, in the Valley. They must not be allowed to leave. So Lee understands that more troops that the Federals that the Confederates can distract in the Valley is less troops that will be faced on the peninsula. This precipitates Stonewall Jackson, the beginning of the Jackson Valley campaign, with the Battle of Kernstown here on the 23rd of March, 1862, where the Confederates march down the valley, and yes, it's down the valley to march north because of the way the rivers flow, and attack here at Kernstown on the 23rd of March. They get defeated. But this surge of Confederates, Lincoln and Stanton asked McClellan, what have you really left behind? And he's like, oh yeah, just, some artillery, things like that, and they'll be fine. I'm taking everything else with me. And they're no, and actually the words are, our orders are not complied with. And so, because of Kernstown, not only is Banks's sailing orders canceled, in other words, he's going to stay in the Valley, McDowell's sailing orders are canceled also, and he is ordered down here to Fredericksburg to kind of pacify this area and kind of control this area, and if necessary, march on to Richmond. When McClellan gets those orders, he tells his wife in a letter, this is the most infamous thing in history. We'll come back to his mentality here in a little bit. But that's something that that I want to point out right off the bat is the scope of the war and the fact that the Confederates all through this campaign will see the Valley and the peninsula as interlocked. It's not until June of 1862 that the Federals will as well. So that means that when Jackson, throughout the summer, throughout May, when he starts chasing Federal forces up and down the Valley, the Federals, he's doing the same thing because Banks has orders to march to Fredericksburg and then march on Richmond. When he starts doing that, McDowell is ordered to go to the Valley. He's ordered back to Fredericksburg. He's ordered back again. And so basically, Jackson is distracting all these Federal forces up here, ultimately 3 Army Corps worth, about 60,000 men all told, that could very well be used down here on the peninsula. And it's only by early June that Lincoln writes a revealing note, and he talks about how the Confederate game, and he continues to use that word. It's actually one of the last times he uses it to refer to military operations. The Confederate game is to distract us here in the Valley from the main front in front of Richmond. Guess what? Yes, you're right. They've been doing it since March, and you're only now figuring it out. Okay, so that's the first thing that I would mention is when you think about this campaign, these campaigns, realize that the Valley and the peninsula are interlocked and have a direct relationship to each other, but only one side, the Confederate side, fully appreciates that from the beginning. Now, there are a couple other things I want to mention as well as we think about scope. Okay, we look back on the Civil War through the perspective of even the later years, 1863 to 65. We also have the experience of the world wars and large conflicts, even Vietnam, where there were 500,000 men in South Vietnam in 1969, 500,000 men and women. So for us, McClellan having about 100,000 men on the peninsula, we view that a little differently than they did in 1862. And let me explain. There are several things about this campaign that make it superlative. The first thing is the size of the armies. As I mentioned, McClellan, 100,000. What was the largest army ever commanded by a U.S. officer in battle prior to 1861? Does anyone have any idea? It was George Washington and his 17,000 men at Yorktown. Now, when you realize that the pre-war size of the U.S. Army is 15,000 men, and when you start to think about the size of some of these Army Corps, you realize that this is a scale and a scope unlike anything that has ever been seen before in American military history, okay? So everybody is learning on the fly. Everybody's learning as they go. There's a couple of other things that should be mentioned as well. I've already alluded to what I'm going to talk about here, which is the creation of Army Corps. This is the first campaign in American military history where Army Corps headquarters are used. The Federals number them, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th. The Confederates call them wings or commands. Either way, they're multi-divisional commands. This is a very big deal, okay? The Army Corps itself hasn't really been around all that long. It was an invention by Napoleon back about 50 or 60 years before these campaigns. But it's the first time the U.S. Army and by extension the Confederate Army are using them. So that may not sound like a tremendous amount, but think about the experience of all of these professional soldiers, particularly somebody like George McClellan, who is used to an army where the army commander controls the divisions directly below. And the divisions, it's maybe an army, in the case of Winfield Scott in Mexico, 15,000 men. Now you're commanding 5 corps. Each of those corps is at least the size of Scott's army going to Mexico City. And it's an echelon of command you haven't seen before. To put it in an analogy, think of it as a company that is expanding, and the CEO now has a level of management between themselves and, for lack of a better term, the worker bees, the frontline team, that wasn't there before. Do you think there's going to be some growing pains? Do you think there's going to be some confusion Do you think these newly promoted corps commanders are going to really understand their roles and how they interplay with the people above them and below them? There's a growing, or there's a learning curve among all these leaders on both sides. And I should mention one other thing. All the stuff that the Army uses today to train officers to command divisions and corps and armies in the field and be staff officers for those organizations to help the commanders, the Command and General Staff School, the War College, things like that. None of that existed until the 20th century. Okay? So this is warfare on a scale and involving organizations unlike anything we've seen before. And the last thing I'll mention about McClellan's campaign, and this is something that is of significance, is McClellan's campaign is the first really truly joint campaign in the war or in American history. We have had Army-Navy cooperation before, Yorktown, Mexico, but at some point, the Army jettisons the Navy, like at Mexico City, the Veracruz. There was an Army-Navy expedition against Veracruz, but once Veracruz was taken, the Navy stayed behind and the Army advanced to Mexico City. McClellan's plan has the Navy supporting the Army of the Potomac march all the way up to Richmond. We look back on that today through many decades of military history since and don't think much of that. Even looking at Vicksburg, we don't think much of that. It's brand new in 1862. Okay, so that's something that should be kept in mind. So we've already talked about the Valley. We've already talked a little bit about its impact on the Peninsula campaign. I want to talk a little bit more about George McClellan because there's a tremendous amount that can be said about George McClellan and his army on the peninsula. The first thing that I will mention is McClellan, when he gets to Yorktown and finds the 10,000 Confederate defenders here at Yorktown, he immediately lays siege to the place. Now, there are a lot of people that criticize him for that. Because when he arrives at Yorktown in early April, as his army's building up, he starts with 50,000 men. There are 10,000 Confederates opposite him. Now, of course, the commander, a very theatrical guy named John Bankhead Magruder, is doing everything he can to deceive McClellan and get McClellan to think there are more Confederates than there are. Famously, of course, marching the Confederates around in circles through the clearings and dragging horses, to raise dust clouds, dragging branches behind him, things like that. So Magruder's doing his best. But why, people look, why is this? Why does McClellan bring a big siege train of heavy artillery, including rail artillery, with him to go besiege Yorktown and then ultimately Richmond? Well, this is one of the few times I'm actually going to say that McClellan should get a pass, or there's something to be said for his mentality. Because has McClellan ever seen fortifications like this before in his career? The answer, of course, is yes. He saw them in Crimea, not 5 years, 6 years before. We should never, ever forget that these soldiers, these officers, when they get to the Civil War, they are drawing on their experiences of the past. And in many ways, the Civil War, for some of them, is the culmination of a career. For others, is a major milestone in their career. For George McClellan, 34-year-old George McClellan, he's one of those that immediately draws on his experiences. And what is he seeing? He's seeing the Russian defenses at Sevastopol. He was part of the Delafield Commission, the 3 officers that the Army tapped to go observe the Crimean War. And they wrote a huge report about it. And McClellan, being an engineer officer, studied the fortifications of Sevastopol. He also analyzed cavalry operations. So yes, that means he wrote an Army analysis of the charge of the Light Brigade. So when he gets to Yorktown, I've seen fortifications like this before. It is going to take a multi-month, if not multi-year siege, just like it did for the British and French, just like I saw in Crimea. Okay, so that is something that in this case, I understand. Doesn't necessarily excuse McClellan's, particularly when reconnaissances along the line demonstrate that the Confederates are a lot weaker than McClellan seems to think. It doesn't excuse those decisions. But whenever I tend to believe that these officers are not dumb people. And whenever they make what appear to be questionable decisions, I try and find the explanation. And this decision to besiege Yorktown and bring a siege train to Richmond and adopt some of the tactics that he does, to me, part, if not a majority of the explanation for his thinking lies in what he saw in Crimea. Okay. And so that's something that I would encourage you, to understand McClellan on the peninsula, you need to understand Major George McClellan on the Crimea and what he observed and what he studied. So that's the first thing that I would mention about McClellan. There's a couple of other things that I would mention about McClellan's leadership as the campaign wears on. We've already talked a little bit about his mentality. And he talks more and more. His private letters, and particularly in this campaign, to be honest, to quote the man is to indict the man. His private letters to his wife and even some of his official communications are extremely revealing. He talks about the what he perceives as the meddling of people in Washington. He refers to Washington as a snake pit. Tells his wife he's very happy that he's out of there. His relationship with or lack thereof, or strained relationship, to be very polite about it, with Lincoln, and his views on Lincoln are well documented. But the other thing he writes to his wife in early April speaks to a couple of things we've been talking about, but also speaks to him as a leader. Because remember, one of the things you do as a leader is you assemble the team. Picking a good team, picking a good lineup is a big part of being a CEO or a director, and getting them in the right places and to function as a team. One of the things that McClellan begins to complain to his wife about is, I have to do everything myself, quote, for a want of good staff officers, unquote. And I see some body language reactions. You know where I'm going with this. We should not forget, first of all, he's learning on the fly, running an army this large. But if he starts complaining about his staff officers, number one, why doesn't he replace them? Number two, they're people that were not thrust upon him. They're ones he chose. But he allows himself to overwork. He takes on more and more and gets bogged down into the minutia of the administrative minutia of the army. And it exhausts him physically and emotionally. There's the famous cliche, the fatigue makes cowards of us all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that impact during the 7 days. But you start to see it even here at Yorktown. He's so bogged down, and some of you probably know people or have worked with leaders or have studied leaders that are so bogged down on what's right in front of them, what the Army today calls the 10 to 25 meter targets. They forget what they're really there for, and they get lost in the weeds, to use another expression. And so you start to see some of this in McClellan's leadership here in the peninsula. Of course, he manages to break the line at Yorktown, or actually lay siege, and the Confederates retreat just in time, and pursues up the peninsula, win a battle here at Williamsburg on May 5th, 1862. And then as they approach Richmond, McClellan has a decision to make. His plans assume that he can use the James River and naval support all the way into Richmond. But it gets scrambled at the last minute for an action that deserves far more attention than it has gotten. You see Drury's Bluff right here, where I've got my cursor? 7 miles downstream of Richmond. As McClellan's army is moving up the peninsula, the Navy decides, we're going to try and run the batteries here at Drury's Bluff and take Richmond from the river. Now, that may sound preposterous, except that David G. Farragut had just done that at New Orleans just a few weeks earlier. It's actually the largest naval battle between the Revolutionary War and 1942. But that's a whole other talk for a whole other time, perhaps. So they try and run these batteries. They're not successful in doing it, partly because of good Confederate artillerists who want their revenge, because these are the gunners from the CSS Virginia, which had to be scuttled back here in Norfolk. So they want their revenge on the Federal Navy. Part of it is the guns are too high, so the Federals literally cannot elevate their guns far enough. So they have to withdraw after skirmishing and some damage. McClellan is requested, send us an infantry brigade. Give us an infantry brigade. We can take these batteries and we can assist you going all the way into Richmond. McClellan refuses that request. The Navy and the Army, there's no supreme commander between the two. They are ordered to cooperate. They are co-equal commanders. So, and that's another thing today with joint doctrine, there's one supreme commander of all services. But at that time, that hadn't been written yet. So the Navy is stuck. But this has a profound impact on McClellan's campaign because now, because of the stoppage at Drury's Bluff on May 15th, 1862, McClellan cannot count on the James River being available for him to use his supplies and support all the way into Richmond. Okay, James is out. What's the other option? The other option is to go up the York River to West Point and then by rail in to Richmond from the east. I'm tracing it here with my cursor. More vulnerable to Confederate guerrillas and cavalry. And as you approach Richmond, you have to straddle your army over the Chickahominy River, which runs diagonal across the front of Richmond. So half of McClellan's army has to be north of the Chickahominy where his railroad is, and the other half has to be south of the Chickahominy where Richmond is. Does this create an opening for the Confederates? You betcha. Joe Johnston tries to take advantage of it and loses at the Battle of Seven Pines, Fair Oaks on the 31st of May and 1st of June. Of course, he is shot in the process and is replaced by General Lee. And then General Lee will exploit it to great advantage and with a vengeance during the 7 days battles, the 26th of June to the 1st of July of 1862. That failure at Drury's Bluff therefore influences the rest of the campaign. And it forces McClellan's hand. We should never forget, there's the old saw that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. In this case, logistics matter a tremendous amount, particularly when you think about the size of the army. Now, McClellan, during the Battle of Fair Oaks, is at his headquarters and is extremely remote because he's collapsed from exhaustion. It's not the first time or the last time that's going to happen. And as a matter of fact, if you read during the 7 days battles after the Battle of Gaines Mill on the 27th of June, McClellan writes a letter, a very fraught letter to Lincoln that night, as his brother-in-law is dying above him in the upstairs of his headquarters that's been turned into a hospital. And he talks about how the sad remnants of my army behave as men. That's how he starts the communication. And if you read the rest of it, and I encourage you, it's the famous Savage Station letter, as it's known, from where his headquarters was. He talks about all these things that have happened and all this, and he says, I am not responsible for this. You have denied me reinforcements. He goes on and on and on about these things. It's a singular piece of communication in American military history. And then at the end, he says, if I save this army, it will be through no thanks of you. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. And he sends it to the President of the United States. Only a man who is physically and emotionally exhausted and therefore not thinking correctly, not in his right mind, would dispatch a communication like that. The telegraph operator in Washington is so shocked by it, he deletes the last two lines, which I quoted to you, and gives it to Lincoln. It's only a few months later that Lincoln realizes there was a bit more to the message. But that gives you an idea of McClellan's mentality and his exhaustion. He's at the absolute point of collapse. And it influences his generalship. It influences, the old saw and the old thing I used to teach when I taught our officer cadets at Fort Knox. If you're no good to yourself, you're no good to your team or your mission. We call it self-care today. McClellan did not practice that. And he collapsed. He collapsed again at the end of the campaign, where during the Battle of during the Battle of Glendale, where his army is fighting for its life, he's on a boat on the bay, drinking wine and eating oysters and exercising very little command. So it's a collapse. It's a complete collapse of an army commander. And his letters and things like that, his writings show that. If you really read it, some of the stuff that's been published and some of the biographies, it's extremely well documented, and it's a lesson. It's a lesson to today's leaders. I do want to say a quick word about Robert E. Lee and the 7 days, because Robert E. Lee is also exhausted at the end. He's commanding 5 corps-sized groups with a very small staff over a very dispersed area on the offense. And the offense always requires more energy than the defense. But Lee also breaks new ground in a new way as well, because he is the first American to command multiple independent armies on a field of battle. 4 of those commands are in his Army of Northern Virginia. The 5th command is the Army of the Valley under Stonewall Jackson, which has arrived, and Jackson has his own issues with fatigue during the 7 days. There's a great essay by one of my mentors, Bob Crick, called Sleepless in the Saddle, talking about Stonewall Jackson during the 7 days and how his lack of sleep impacted the Army of the Valley. But Jackson is an Army commander. The Army of the Valley does not lose that designation until August of 1862, when it is folded in and becomes a left wing of the Army of Northern Virginia. And, we're talking about organizational things, right? These may sound like dry organizational details, but to a military officer, they most definitely are not. And I can see a couple of heads nodding or reacting in agreement. These most definitely are not. And so that's why you see, and you kind of see it through Lee and Jackson's relationship until Jackson's death in 1863, where Lee treats Jackson kind of 1/2 step off of being an equal. And it starts here. It actually started way back at Kernstown, I would argue, but it really gets reinforced here during the Valley Campaign, where the Army of the Valley is always consistently maneuvered on the left flank of the Confederate forces. So there's a certain level of independence that Lee gives Jackson, and Lee maneuvers the other 4 commands. And so if you study the Confederate movements, you see how Lee executes that. Again, we look back on that today. Sherman had an army group that took Atlanta in 1864. Pershing led an army group in France in World War I. There were several U.S. Army groups in World War II, obviously. So we look back on that, okay, we don't think much of it. It was brand new stuff, brand new tactics, and Lee was breaking new ground on his side as well. I should point out one more thing about the scope and scale of this fighting. Everybody talks about how Shiloh was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. Do you know how long Shiloh held that title? 10 weeks. It gets passed by the 7 days, and Gaines Mill itself passes Shiloh. That title will then again be assumed by Antietam in September of 1862, and then by Chancellorsville, and then by Gettysburg. So you are starting to see blood run. And in 1862 and in 1863, Americans are going to wade through blood in a way that we never have up to this time in American military history. Okay, and so think about what that does. Think about what that does to the mentality of both sides. So I do want to make a couple other comments as we move into Second Manassas here, and I do want to talk a little bit about how the war is starting to change, because once Lincoln attacks or Lee attacks at the 7 days, it becomes very clear this is not going to be a short war. There's the famous thing about Grant. I didn't think they were real serious until after Shiloh. There's a lot of that mentality in the East until after the 7 days. The Union Army had stopped recruiting in June of 1862. You don't stop recruiting unless you think the war is almost over. And they had reason to think that with the Army of the Potomac within earshot of the church bells of Richmond. They start recruiting again after the 7 days. But it also forces Lincoln to start thinking about, okay, the war is going to go on. This is not going to be short. It's not going to be light. How are we going to grind the Confederacy down? How are we going to beat them? We have to beat them not just on the battlefield, but we have to start beating them in other arenas as well. And the man who really starts to embody this policy is John Pope, who was brought east to take command of the Valley forces under what's known as the Army of Virginia, title Army of Virginia, and concentrate them right in the area I'm circling here with my cursor. John Pope issues a lot of orders. Some of them very badly worded. For example, telling his folks, his new command, "I come from the west where we have seen nothing but the backs of our enemies. I will keep my headquarters in the saddle," which Confederates and Union officers alike say, isn't that where your hindquarters should be? You're keeping your headquarters where your hindquarters should be. But he also issues orders that make the war harder. Burn fence rails, live off the land. If marauders start shooting at you, go after them, arrest them, burn the houses, do what you have to do to suppress the enemy. This is a new war. The war is getting harder. It's going to be, and oh, by the way, if slaves escape into the line, don't send them back. So you're starting to see a change in the way that the Union it's going to be a much harder hand of war that Union forces are going to start to pursue a policy. And many of those orders that Pope writes are actually written by Lincoln and Stanton and then issued under Pope's name. This horrifies McClellan and many of his officers who believe in a much easier form of warfare. Matter of fact, Lee's family at West Point had been protected by a guard by McClellan so that their property wouldn't be messed with. And as one of Pope's subordinates, Fitzjohn Porter, said, Pope has demonstrated to us what we always thought, and he is an ass. So, but that gives you an idea. There's this debate going on. And it's also about this time that Lincoln, as soon as he gets a new general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, shows an order to his cabinet, and he says, I want to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. I want to strike at the heart of the Southern economy. And their reaction is, that's great. Wait for a victory to give it some teeth. Otherwise, it looks like you're throwing sand into the wind. But these are all discussions going on in the Lincoln administration in June and July after the 7 days, when it looks like it's going to be a longer war, harder war, and therefore a wider war. And John Pope and his policies illustrate that. McClellan is also ordered to leave the peninsula, where he's retreated to Harrison's Landing, and to join with Pope. He takes his time. And as he says later, I believe we should leave Pope to get out of his scrape and go to the defense of the capital. John Pope, there's many, many things I can say about John Pope at Second Manassas. In the interest of time, I will keep it fairly brief. I will simply say that Pope's another one that's on a learning curve. He's also facing a very good, tested army. It's the first real ride of the reorganized Army of Northern Virginia, with Lee, Longstreet, Jackson, and Jeb Stuart functioning as the team that will produce the victories that they produce. And I would argue, actually, in many ways, the victory that Lee wins at Second Manassas at the end of August 1862 is the greatest victory of the war for him. It's not Chancellorsville, it's this one, where he drives Pope off the old Bull Run battlefield in near route. Pope didn't have to fight at Bull Run. His mission was to keep Lee at bay until McClellan could join up, and then the combined armies would go after Robert E. Lee. All he has to do when he finds part of Lee's army, in this case Jackson's wing, at Second Manassas, at the old Manassas battlefield, is to retreat across Bull Run and sit there. But Pope, being aggressive, attacks Jackson, and that gives Lee the opening to win the battle. There's a lot you can criticize about Pope's generalship. One of the ones I would point out, and this is a leader lesson, is never lose sight of your objective. And he allowed his personal passions to override and have him lose sight of the objective. Chantilly, by the way, on the 1st of September 1862, is not anticlimax. And you can see Chantilly right here on the map. Lee is trying one more time. He's got 30 miles between Manassas and Washington. He is trying one more time to get around Pope, cut Pope off from Washington, and try and beat him. It doesn't work, significantly due to the valor of some Massachusetts units, among others, and the self-sacrifice of Isaac Ingalls Stevens, who has his own New England roots, and Phil Kearny. And so by September 3rd, Pope's army is back in Washington. And that brings me to the final point I want to talk about these campaigns. Think about where we were 70 days before September 3rd, which is June 26th, 1862. The Army of the Potomac is within earshot of the Confederate capital. They're within earshot of the church bells of Richmond. Within 70 days, in some of the largest and bloodiest battles yet seen on the North American continent, the Confederates have undone all of the Federal gains in Virginia. and have driven this army with its reinforcements of Pope's army back to the defenses of Washington in 70 days. This is a change of fortune in American military history that ranks only with Trenton, Princeton, the breakout from Normandy in 1944, and Incheon Yalu in the Korean War. In fact, there was a George Templeton Strong, the noted New York businessman, wrote, he said, in September 1, 1862, for the first time, I feel like Washington may be taken. And so what you've got is you've got a tremendous ebb and flow, and that swing of fortunes, in addition to everything else that we've talked about, give these campaigns their drama and their importance. And in many ways, because of the policies and because of the fact that the 7 days, the Union defeat at the 7 days demonstrates that this war will go on. It will not be short. It will therefore be hard. It will be wide, and reunion will come at a tremendously, will be a tremendously transformative thing because of what's going to happen. And that, in addition to everything else that we've talked about, gives these campaigns their importance, and a much greater importance than what in many ways they have been imparted up to this time. So as I conclude, and I'm about to open it for questions, and I imagine a group like this, I'm going to have quite a few, which is great. As you think about these campaigns going forward, as you read about them again, or perhaps relook them after tonight, I encourage you to think about these things and keep these things in mind as you consider them going forward. These campaigns deserve a far greater stature than what they have. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you very much for having me tonight.